you okay now, Soundman? Mr. Soundman? Okay. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about the history of music in the 20th century and about the history of painting and how I believe the two of them came together. And then I want to talk about my own work in relationship to that. So, the great revolution in music in the 18th century was the orchestra. The orchestra was a new technology, and the people who knew how to handle the orchestra were the people we call composers. That was a new skill, to be able to deal with looking after and controlling 60 or 100 musicians, and the whole technology of scores and ranking systems evolved to deal with that. That was a real revolution in music. In the 20th century, the revolution in music was recording. Recording started actually just before the 20th century began, but it began to have an impact on music in about the 1920s, 1930s. Now, I want to talk about recording a little bit because it's sort of central to everything else that I'm going to talk about tonight. Before people were able to record music, music was something that could only exist at a particular moment in time and at a particular place. Music was linked to time and place intimately. With recording, music became detached from time and place. Soundman, is it better if I stand at the back of the stage? No sound. I'll stand at the back of the stage so I don't feed back so much. Maybe we can... Is there anybody who can take this thing away? It's no use to you. Can somebody get this thing off, please? Hello? So here I am, alone in a large theatre with a crowd of people. Thank you, that's much better. And I'm going to stand here so I don't get so much feedback. See you later. What happened as soon as people became able to record sound is that sound stopped being an ephemeral medium, and it became a plastic medium. As soon as you could record sound, you could take it somewhere else. For example, you could listen to it at another time. You could listen to the same thing again and again and again. You have to imagine that until about 100 years ago, that wasn't possible. Anything you heard once only. Only once, in that form. So sound, until very recently, in human history that is, was an immediately lost form. As soon as sound became plastic, that's to say, as soon as it became malleable, you could cut it, you could stretch it, you could turn it upside down, it stopped being music in the traditional sense, and it became part of the plastic arts. And what I want to argue is that the 20th century saw the development of a new art form, which we still call music, but which really should have a totally different name. Now, if you think about what happened to theatre early part of the last century, about the same time that recording of music was beginning, people were starting to film theatre. And if you look at the early films, they're basically plays which have been filmed. Within about 15 or 20 years, people started realizing that you could do things with a film camera and with editing that you couldn't do in a theatre. And very quickly they realized that this was a different art form. It was called cinema. You know, you can make close-ups in cinema. You can shoot from different angles. You can edit from this moment to a moment in the future or a moment in the past. You can change locations quickly. All of the things that you can do in a film, which you couldn't do on theatre, gave rise to this new name, this new form called cinema. Something very similar happened in music, but we didn't give it a new name. We still call it music. The thing that we still call music, the stuff being made in recording studios, doesn't have much to do with traditional music. Just as cinema doesn't have much to do with traditional theatre. And with the birth of this new form, this new plastic art, which we still call music, came a number of new talents, a number of new possibilities for jobs. Just as in a sense the orchestra invented the composer, the recording studio invented the producer. The producer is the person who understands the recording situation. That's what producing means, I think. Now, something very profound started to happen around about the late 1950s, when people started realizing that you could use recording to do things that had never been possible musically before. For example, Les Paul, the guy who invented the famous Les Paul guitars, he started to realize that you could actually add guitar to guitar to guitar, so that you didn't have to do the recording as a performance. You didn't have to all be in the room playing at the same time. You could have put one guitar down today, record it, take it home, listen to it, come back the next day, add another one on top of it. So you could build a composition over time in exactly the same way that you build a painting. By 1960s, people like Phil Spector, Joe Meek, Jerry Morton, various others, were starting, George Martin of course, was starting to realize that this thing called the recording studio was really a way of painting with sound. And that's kind of the point I want to make here, that recording as a form of art is closer to painting than it is to music. That doesn't mean to say that all recordings are like that. You know, you can still have a situation where a band walks into a studio, stands in front of microphones and plays a song and walks out again. But not much music is made that way now. In fact, most of the music you will hear on the radio, and probably most of the music in your record collection, wasn't made that way. It's made in a much more synthetic way. And synthetic, by the way, is not a criticism for me. Synthetic is what I do. I like it. So throughout the 20th century, mostly in pop music, because the classical music world didn't understand recording at all, as far as I can see, until very recently. Until Glenn Gould, really. Glenn Gould was the first classical musician that I know of who really grasped the idea that making a record was different from recording a performance. But aside aside from him, there haven't been very many examples of classical people really understanding what this wonderful new instrument called the recording studio is. But in pop music, that has become the sort of center of making popular music. So we had people like Phil Spector, who built these amazing panoramas of sound through careful use of the studio. People like George Martin, who introduced whole new forms of music into a record, just imported them and collaged them in. And I use the word collage again to draw the parallel with painting. People who've been composing for the last 50 years or so in the recording studio have been doing a new kind of composing. I'll go back to that in a minute. I want to just now look at what was happening in painting in the 20th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, here in Russia, abstract painting was born. Vasily Kandinsky, the great painter, walked back into his studio one evening, so the story goes, and he caught sight of one of his pictures which he put down sideways. It was the wrong way up. And suddenly he saw a picture that had no subject matter. It wasn't a picture of something. It was just a picture. I don't know if this story is true, but I'm sure something like that must have happened. But for the previous 40 years, painting had been moving further and further away from the idea of being a picture of something, and became more and more abstract painting. For instance, the Impressionists were working with fields of color. The Fauvists, that there was a general feeling that painting should be about itself, that painting should be a sensual experience, not necessarily depicting another experience. So you had Kandinsky, I think in 1908, looked at that picture turned on its side. At the same time in Paris you had Picasso starting to work with Cubism, which is deliberately a form of painting which is to do with time and motion, to do with change. Now, early in the 20th century, I'm not sure when, Walter Pater said something which relates very strongly to what was going on in painting at that time. He said, all art aspires to the condition of music. And there was a very, very strong and deliberate movement in the early 20th century to move painting as an art towards music, towards being like music. Music has always been an abstract art. Music is never about something. It's never a picture of a real acoustic scene that happens in your life. So music, in that sense, is an abstract art. And painters were struggling with this problem of how do we move painting away from figuration and towards abstraction. And they looked to music for their examples. In fact, if you look at a lot of the titles of paintings from that early 20th century period, they have names like Symphony No. 2 and Concerto, and they use musical names to play on the fact that they are trying to be like music. When I went to art school in the mid-1960s, there were some very strong currents in the air, lots of them actually. The period of austerity after the Second World War had pretty much ended, and there was a feeling of hope. There was a feeling that things were going to get better. In fact, there was a feeling that things were always going to get better, that the graph was going upwards. That turned out to be not quite true, but nonetheless, it was an infection, this feeling. Everybody felt it. And one of the manifestations of that in the arts was that art could be part of the new world, the new way of thinking about the world, and that art could be used as an example and a provocation to a new way of thinking. Art was, in that sense, very political. It wasn't explicitly political. It didn't say, go out and vote for the Communist Party or go out and vote for the Conservative Party. It wasn't political in that sense. It was political in the sense that it said, somehow or other, your art has to be your philosophy. When I went to art school, there was one name who was very important to me, and he was the composer John Cage. My painting teacher, Tom Phillips, introduced me to the work of John Cage. What impressed me about Cage was that for him, art should be embodied philosophy. That was his phrase, I think. The practice of art should be a way of thinking. Should be a way of using your mind in a meta-linguistic way, in a non-linguistic way perhaps, to conceive of and to address philosophical thoughts. Cage, of course, wasn't a painter, he was a composer. I was supposed to be studying painting. At the same time as this, there was an amazing revolution going on in music. I mentioned earlier Phil Spector and George Martin and so on, but that was only the beginning of the story. There was a lot going on in music, in popular music and actually in experimental music as well. And my interest started really in experimental music. I listened to pop music, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't play any instruments. The instrument that I was going to play didn't really exist at that time. I became interested in composers like Cage, Cornelius Cardew, Christian Wolff, Morton Feldman, Earl Brown, a whole group of them, because they were writing a kind of music that actually I could play. A lot of their music was written for non-musicians. For instance, Cage's famous piece, 4 minutes 33 seconds, in which the performer does nothing, is very easy to play actually. I could teach you. There were some famous pieces by Lamont Young. In fact, the very first piece of music I ever performed publicly was a piece by Lamont Young called X for Henry Flint. X was a number that you, the performer, had to choose. And in X for Henry Flint, you sat at the piano, you spread your arms like that, and you bashed the piano keys X times. When I decided to perform this piece, I stupidly chose 3,600 as my X. I thought I could do it once a second, but actually I was much slower than that, and the piece took nearly 2 hours to perform. And the audience, which at the beginning had numbered 13 people, at the end numbered 2. That was me and my girlfriend. But as a piece of music, that is an astonishing experience. Certainly for the performer, it's an astonishing experience because it leaves you bruised on both arms. However, my point is that there was coming into existence then a new kind of music that didn't depend on the types of skills that traditional music depended on. It suddenly offered somebody like me, a young painter, the possibility of doing something in music. So there were 2 things happening that said to people like me, you can do music. One of them was this new experimental music which didn't address itself to traditionally trained players. But the other was this new music that was emerging in the world of pop, which, as I said, used this just emerging technology called the recording studio. And it said, really, you can paint with sound. And that's the important thing to me, the idea that you could paint with sound. So, this idea wasn't clear to me in 1965 or 66, but it gradually started to become clear over the next 5 years that that was what I wanted to do. And it became clear to me because I would notice when I listened to records, I wasn't really interested in what the singer was singing about. I couldn't give a toss what the lyrics are, really. Translate that. What I was interested in was what was going on behind the music, the landscapes that were being painted. If you listen to songs really beginning from 1962, I guess, the world of sound becomes more and more important. The song stays in its place, but the world of sound grows bigger and bigger around it. It's no longer, a guitar, and bass and drums. It's a sort of an enormous landscape of sound. And it was those landscapes that interested me. I thought, I bet I could make those. And gradually, of course, that's what I started doing. But there was something else that interested me as well, which was that this kind of music that was starting to evolve told me different things about social organization. Now that sounds like a big step, so I have to go back a bit to talk about this. I mentioned earlier the classical orchestra. If you think about the social structure of an orchestra, you have God, then you have the composer, then you have the conductor, then you have the leader of the orchestra, then you have the section principals, lead violin, lead whatever they need to, then you have the section sub-principals, then you have what are called, interestingly, the rank and file. That's a picture of how an orchestra, a classical orchestra works. I might have a picture of that. Hold on. I don't know whether this is going to work. Whoops. No, that's not going to work, is it? Hello. Oh, well, there's my little diagram of an orchestra. I can make that a bit clearer on a piece of paper. So you have God. Because, as you know, music is always inspired by the divine. the conductor. Then you have the section principals, leader of the orchestra, section principals, sub-principals, rank and file. And the last thing you have, and actually the least important thing in this picture, on the other side of the stage, you have the audience. And that line, the side of the stage, is a very important division. These people sitting here are so terrified that they daren't even cough. This person here is so powerful that they daren't even cough. If you look at this as a picture of power, all the power is up there. And the power diminishes all the way down that tree. If you look at it as a sort of information map, all the information goes in that direction. Nothing goes back up. It goes like that. If you look at it as an inspiration map, lots of inspiration up there. This, there's a sort of map of inspired activity. This is where it all happens, in the top here. When you get down to here, these people are sitting still. They are not expected to contribute in any way at all, except by applauding at the end. Which is, by the way, what I want from you. Not quite yet. But, so this diagram, oh, that's the wallpaper, that's lucky. I thought I'd just been given one sheet of paper, sort of Soviet style, you know. So that diagram, that pyramid, there are really only 3 organizations in the world now that still use that as their operating structure. One is the orchestra. The next one is the church. And the last one is the army. Those are the only 3 organizations that still believe that that is a good way of working. And in a sense, with all of them, there's that same barrier, this barrier here. The barrier here is between the orchestra and the audience. Here is the church and the congregation. And here it's the army and what will be the victims. As a model of organization, that doesn't appeal to me very much. And it doesn't work very well. That's the other problem. It doesn't work. What interested me about pop music, particularly now I'm talking about the kind of pop music that I've been describing, pop music made in studios, made with the skills of a lot of people, is that this picture disappears. What you have instead is suddenly a field of possibilities. Of course you have somebody who thinks of the song, and then you have other people who help arrange the song, then you have this person who's the producer, then you have the engineer, then you have the people who design the instruments and the software and so on and so on. So you end up with a very large group of people involved in making this kind of art, just as you do in cinema. You know, cinema involves huge numbers of people. I'm always amazed when I see the end of the film and the credits are nearly as long as the film was, you know. There's sort of 6,000 names come after the film. people who went and got cupcakes during the production and so on. But this form of social organisation is characteristic, I think, of 20th century art and 21st century as well. And I have a name for this. So, in this picture here, that person, which is that person, we call the genius. What I call this situation is a scenius. This is a word I invented, and it's meant to mean collective genius, collective intelligence. So, in fact, this word came to me really as a result of seeing an exhibition in London of Russian paintings from the early 20th century. It was a show at the Barbican, which is a big gallery in London. And I've always been interested in that period painting, and I thought I knew a lot about it. I went to this exhibition and I must have seen works by at least 70 painters I'd never heard of before. Good paintings. 70 Russian paintings that I, who studied Russian painting, had never heard of. I can hear another voice. Is somebody else giving a lecture as well? I don't mind. So I looked at this and I thought, so what was happening in St. Petersburg and Moscow at that time? Particularly St. Petersburg, actually. And I thought what was happening was that there was a whole scene of people who were supporting each other, looking at each other's work, copying from each other, stealing ideas, contributing ideas. And, you know, I had thought, oh, Kandinsky is a great painter, Rodchenko is interesting, Taplin, I knew all the big names, but I suddenly realized that they weren't that much more important than all of the other people in the scene. The whole scene was important. So this is when I came up with this word, scenius. You know, recent scenes like that. The Bauhaus was a scene like that. San Francisco in the 60s was a scene like that. Silicon Valley in the 90s was a scene like that. There are often places on Earth where suddenly it's quite easy to do something quite brilliant. And so I started to think, I want to make music in this way, not in that way. Then in about 1967 or 68, I started to become aware of what became called American minimalism. This was the music of people like Terry Riley, Steve Reich, Philip Glass. What interested me about these composers was that they were really taking a different position as composers. They of course came out of that world, but they weren't in that world any longer. It became very clear to me one evening I listened for the first time to a piece by Steve Reich called It's Gonna Rain. I'm going to take a walk again now, light now. It's Gonna Rain is a very, very simple piece of music. At least it looks very simple. Steve Reich had been recording preachers in the streets of, I think, New Orleans. And one day he was playing around with his tapes. and he cut a little loop, cut a little stretch of tape, joined it to itself, so he made a loop of tape, and he played it back on a tape recorder, so it just kept going round and round. Then he did something else interesting. He made an identical copy of that, and he cut an identical loop. So he had two loops, just the same, playing on two different machines. And he slightly changed the speed of one of the machines, so that the two loops started running at slightly different speeds, so that gradually every possible combination of those two loops happened. Now, as a piece of music, this is about as simple as you could get. But as a listening experience, it was incredibly complex and interesting. I still find that piece astonishing. You can buy the record of it if you want. It's called It's Gonna Rain by Steve Reich. And it's very good to listen to, especially if you're slightly intoxicated in one way or another. What fascinated me about that piece of music, well, lots of things fascinated me actually. One was that it was a kind of steady state experience. It wasn't organized like other music was organized. It didn't have a kind of a story to it. It wasn't first movement, second movement, third movement, or it wasn't verse, chorus, verse. It was just a condition, like an abstract painting. It was just a thing. And in theory, that thing could have run forever. I mean, it doesn't run forever because you couldn't put forever onto a record at that time. But nonetheless, in principle, it offered the possibility of an endless piece of music. And a lot of things became clear to me when I started listening to this piece. Actually, they became clear to me during listening to it. One was that you could invent a system to produce music. You could invent a kind of machine that you would feed musical material into, and it would then make music forever and ever. This became an ambition for me. The second thing that I found very, very interesting was that the composer could not know all of the results. So this was really a different idea of what being an artist meant. If you read the sleeve notes on classical records, you are always given the impression that Beethoven walked around with whole symphonies playing in his head. And what he did was write them down so that other people could hear them. So that idea of the artist is that the artist already has the work inside his or her head. This new idea, this idea that Steve Reich and Terry Riley and others were starting to explore, was quite different. It said, the artist is not a person who finishes pieces of work, but a person who starts them. So the artist becomes the person who sets the machine in motion, who designs the machine and sets it running. Another example, which some of you may know, is a beautiful piece of music by Terry Riley called In C. In C is a piece of music which I think is 50 bars long or 52 bars long. And each bar is a little phrase in C, in the key of C. And the instructions say that any group of musicians can play this. They all start on bar 1 together at a given tempo. And then each musician decides when to move on to bar 2 and how long to stay on bar 2 and when to move on to bar 3. Is this getting complicated? I think it is. But what it means is that everybody starts together. And gradually, as you go through the piece, more and more bars are being played simultaneously on whatever selection of instruments is there. So this piece is never the same twice. It's an always changing piece. And it's a piece that could, in theory, last for a very long time. If one musician decided to stay on bar 6 for 7.5 hours, the piece would go on for 7.5 hours at least. So I like very much the idea of inventing a kind of music whose outcome was as surprising to the composer as it was to the audience. And I stored that in my head. That was an idea I wanted to try to do. One of the reasons I wanted to do it was because I found that by the early 70s I was starting to listen to music in different ways. I wanted different things from music. In the early 70s everybody had cassette recorders. You would no doubt remember those little plastic things like that with that very thin tape, which always got tangled up in everything. My friends and I, half a dozen people, had started to make tapes of records from our collection and swap them with each other. And what I noticed was that I was making tapes of 1.5 hours of all the same kind of music. I didn't want variety. Now, you have to remember at this time, record companies had a lot of control over what went out on records. And what record companies really liked was one fast song, one ballad, one sad song, one happy song, because they thought that audiences really had to be woken up every few minutes, you know. Audiences couldn't really deal with anything that stayed in the same place for a long time. My friend Peter Schmidt, who was a painter, once made me a cassette tape of the 6 slow movements from the Haydn late string quartets. Just the slow movements. It was the most beautiful tape. I listened to it until I wore it out, I think. And in doing so, I realized that I didn't want music that kept changing. I wanted music to be like an environment, like a place that I could go to, like a painting, actually. That was what I wanted from music. Just as when you have a painting on the wall, you don't expect to turn around and see that it suddenly turned red when it was green last week. You want that painting to be there and to be that painting. So I thought, I want to make music that aspires to the condition of painting. It's a sort of reverse of what Walter Pater said. It wasn't only, lots of other people had the same feeling at the same time, which is why the idea of ambient, which is what I call this kind of music eventually, caught on eventually after 20 years or so. It was an idea that was in the air. So what I was doing was trying to move music further away from its roots in performance and closer towards something like painting, like the experience of painting. Now, while all this was going on, I had another career as well, another life. I studied painting, I left art school, I joined the band, it became successful, I had a career in music. But I didn't stop making visual art. From about 1975 onwards, I was working with light. I had worked with light when I was at art college. And from about 1975 onwards, I picked up again this idea of working with light. And initially I used video, but not figuratively. I used video as a way of controlling light. Because I think people don't realize that it's just an accident that videos are normally used to show pictures like that. What video really does is enable you to control light over a surface. We normally do it by pointing a camera at something, but actually you don't have to do it that way. So I started making a kind of abstract video art in the late 70s. And again, what I noticed was that I didn't want video to be like television. I didn't want it to be telling stories. I didn't want it to have lots of fast cuts. I didn't want it to be anything like the television experience. I don't like the television experience. I wanted it to be kind of like the painting experience, and like the experience of listening to the kind of music that I was starting to make. So I started making early versions of the kind of work that I should be showing here. And my early versions used video. It's rather complicated to explain how, so I won't even try. Then in about 1986, I started using slide projectors, partly because I was offered a job in Japan that required that I work on a very big surface. I couldn't do that with video. We didn't have video projectors at that time. So I started working with slide projectors, and this is what I did. In fact, I had a show in St-Petersburg in 1998, so some of you may have seen some of the work that belongs to that slide projector period. So, let me see. Okay, well, here's a little... Can you see that drawing? I would make little slides for the slide projector. They're at that big. And I would paint them directly, draw on them, scratch them, do whatever was necessary. And each projector, I used between 5 and 10 projectors normally, would be projecting onto the same surface. So the final image you saw was made up of a combination of many different projectors. And each projector was programmed to randomly and quite slowly fade up and fade out and then change slide. So these combinations, okay, there's 4 slides and there's a combination of them. These combinations were always changing because nothing ever held still. So you got what was sort of like a painting that changed very slowly. So it was like a painting that became like music, I thought. So I was doing 2 things, both heading in the same direction. I was making music that kind of imitated the experience of painting, and I was making painting that kind of imitated the experience of music. So I was looking for this place in between that I felt existed and I could make use of. Sorry, that's another bad diagram. I'll explain what this number is soon. So what happens in these shows now, like the one you're going to see, if you are going to see it this weekend, is some kind of infinitely slowly changing work of art. The piece you'll see this weekend, I worked out, it's called 77 million paintings, but that's actually not true. Each screen makes 77 million paintings. So the total number of combinations is that figure there, which interestingly is described as a yota. I don't know if you know that word. I know that the people sponsoring this show are yota. But this is something like 10 to the 24th, which is a yotta. So it would take a very long time to see the whole show. It would take about as long as 20 universes. So I don't recommend trying to catch the whole thing. But now I want to tell you what interests me about these shows. Well, of course, what interests me first of all is that I think they're fabulous. I love looking at them, I love seeing them. But I also love what happens to other people watching these shows. So I sometimes sit in the back and I see what audiences do. And this is what happens very often. So people walk into the show. And they think it's a little bit interesting, so they're going to lean on something. And I always make sure there are some nice chairs. So eventually they're in the chair, and then after a little while sometimes 2 or 3 hours later they're absolutely flat on the back, looking at the screen. Now, I think this is very interesting behavior, because nothing is going on. If there's no story, there's no melody in the music, there's no drama, and yet somehow people seem to enjoy this experience of just letting go, just letting something happen to them. And you know, we've had shows in lots of parts of the world, and sometimes people will stay for many hours, and sometimes they'll come back the next day and stay for many more hours as well. So not everyone likes it, obviously, but some people like it a lot, and I think, what is going on in people's minds when they're doing this? What's going on in my mind as well, because I do the same thing. I sit and watch them just like everybody else does. And I think one of the things that's going on is people are enjoying an experience which I think is one of the things that we want from art, and it's not a popular thing at the moment. I have to make another drawing. Sorry, man on the lights. One of the things human beings universally like doing is to surrender. Now, I spoke to Sergei, our wonderful translator, about this word because I noticed this word has a slightly different meaning in every language. The meaning I intend is to become part of a passion of some kind. I'm not talking about battlefield surrender. I'm talking about surrender as an active verb. Okay, so let's contrast that with something else. Control. All of us come from advanced technical cultures. All of us come with the idea that the brilliant thing that humans can do is to control things. And indeed, that is what makes us different from other animals in many ways. We have a huge capacity to control. But that capacity isn't infinite. Furthermore, it's often exactly the wrong thing to be doing in certain situations. Now, I think what humans do all the time throughout their lives is that they navigate this spectrum between surrender and control. They do that if they know how to. So to be able to do that, to be able to know when is the time to surrender and when is the time to control, you have to understand surrendering. You have to be able to do it. Just to make this less abstract, think of a surfer. Very easy. What he's doing, somebody surfing, is constantly in a dialogue between surrender and control. You surrender to the wave and let it take you, then you control your fall so you can stay up and get back up again. That's surfing, did I say that? Surfing. Surfing, which I can't do, by the way, I can only theorize about. But surfing is actually what we all do throughout our lives. We're constantly trying to navigate the forces that we can't control and that we have to somehow ride. So, people who can only control are actually severely dysfunctional. They're baffled by many situations, they don't know what to do. One of the things we like so much about so-called primitive peoples is that they're brilliant at surrendering. They know how to make use of all the emergencies of the environment, all the things that happen. They learn skills in terms of surrendering that most of us don't know about. Now, I think humans have a huge appetite for surrender because I think at some evolutionary level, we know that it's very, very important. Every culture we know, there's surrender again, engages in at least 4 forms of surrender. One of them is sex. The next one is drugs, actually, which I could write as intoxication to make it sound better, but actually it's drugs. We don't know any society that doesn't use drugs, which is very interesting, isn't it? Another one is art, and the last one is religion. All of those are invitations to you to surrender. And what does surrender mean? It means I stop being me and I start becoming us. Or I stop being this limited person who likes to know where everything is. Every culture mixes these up in different ways. You know, for instance, in Hinduism, those two are very linked, and that is very linked as well. In various on India, we break down gradually, as is certainly happening, the distinction between, I put my hand high enough, genius, composer, and listener. That we start to change that. We stop thinking of geniuses and we start thinking of geniuses. This is interesting. I didn't really talk about mind and body, but oops, sorry. Do you know what was shocking about Elvis Presley when he appeared? Was that he changed the idea of where music was made, actually. In the classical picture, the music is made from there. When Elvis appeared, it became clear that quite a lot of the music is so clear. tradition of music, an African approach to music, where music is intimately connected with the physical body and sexuality. Well, that part of music had been left out of Western music pretty much for 300 or 400 years. So this reuniting of saying that music can contain both mind and body, and should contain both, this was really a new idea. And the last distinction I want to see healed is the distinction between control and surrender. What I want to say is that all the time in our lives we're doing both of those. And the better we understand each of them, that's to say, the better we understand each end of the spectrum, the easier it is for us to navigate and to choose our point among them. I think that's... I better take some questions because I could not get a clear answer about how long I should talk tonight. So, and I realise that talking through translation is quite exhausting, both for an audience and in particular for the heroic translator. What's that? Okay, these are questions for me to answer. Shall I just start answering? As usual. Nobody's here. Shall I begin on these questions?
Brian, do start.
Okay.
Brian, let's take some questions from the audience. Давайте вопросы из зала. Пока есть микрофон. Вот он в середине зала. Кто первый подошел с умным вопросом, кто-то задал.
Good evening, Brian. I'm Iji from St-Petersburg. And my question is to you as to inventor of ambient music. Is ambient music, the invention of it, somehow connected with hippie movement?
Вопрос с ambient как-то связан с движением хиппи.
I couldn't hear the very last part of the question. I'm so sorry.
Можно еще раз последнюю часть вопроса?
Is the invention of ambient music by you somehow connected with hippies movement?
Ваше изобретение музыки ambient как-то связано с движением хиппи?
Oh, with hippies?
Yes.
С хипанули, да?
I don't know where the question came from, so
Я не знаю, откуда вопрос. Right in the center.
okay.
Look straight.
Okay. It's not really connected with hippies, but it is connected with the same ideas that gave rise to hippies.
Это связано не с хиппи, а с теми идеями, которые привели к возникновению или росту движения хиппи.
So what hippies liked doing was changing their mental space.
Что нравилось делать хиппи? Да, это менять свой ментальный ландшафт, иметь что-то в голове.
And the other thing they like doing, which actually I should have talked about in this talk, so thank you for raising this subject, is they like the idea of becoming immersed in something.
Еще что им нравилось делать, спасибо, что спросили, я про это не говорил, им нравилось погружаться во что-то.
So one of the other things I should have said on my diagram is that one of the differences between the classical approach to looking at art or listening to art and the modern one is that in the classical one, you stay outside your work. In the approach that I've been talking about, you try as hard as possible to get inside it and to be surrounded by it.
Еще что я тебе сказал про различия в подходах классическом и современном, что в классическом подходе слушатель, зритель оставался снаружи работы, а в современном подходе он старается в нее как можно глубже залезть.
So again, it's to do with somehow getting out of control, actually, allowing yourself to go out of control. So it is connected in that sense with what hippies were doing.
И опять же, это о том, чтобы как-то вот выйти из-под контроля, да, не управляться. Поэтому, да, это связано как бы с Библией.
Okay, thank you. I like this.
Мне понравилось.
I feel like a guy in a fairground where people are just throwing things at me.
Как будто вот мне что-то бросают, а я... The listener is missing from the second diagram. You said that, Jeff said that the listener wants to get inside the piece of art. How does he do it?
Turn the volume up.
Погромче делает.
No, that's not a facetious answer actually, because
Я не шучу.
one of the things that was very different about music in the last 50 years is that you could listen to it at home, and if you had a powerful enough amplifier, there was no limit to how loud you could listen. That's a fundamental difference.
За последние 50 лет, чем отличается музыка сейчас от музыки раньше, теперь вы можете слушать музыку дома, вы можете регулировать уровень громкости, можете поднимать эту громкость как можно выше, и вот нет предела.
So you can construct your own hearing space, and then you sat in the middle of it and you were lost in the music.
Так что вы можете создавать свое слушательское пространство, сидеть посреди и погружаться в музыку.
Similarly, when you go to see a show, you expect the music to be not tiny on the stage like this. You expect it to be big.
Так же, как на концерте. Вы идете на концерт, вы же не ждете, что музыка будет звучать где-то там тихонько. Музыки должно быть много.
Unless the message of the music is, look how small I am.
Если только не идея, которую передает музыка, посмотрите, какой я маленький.
Скажите, это относится только к музыке или вообще к современной музыке?
Is it only about music or about contemporary art and such?
Well, I think it's about contemporary art as well. I mean, with what happened with the abstract expressionist painters, for example, in the 40s, was that they stopped making pictures that were like windows that you looked into. They painted right up to the edge of the canvas. So I think the idea there was to say, in a sense, this painting doesn't have a limit. It's a condition. Like I was saying about ambient music, it's a condition that you enter into. It's not a picture of something. It's a place that you visually enter.
Я думаю, что это относится к современному искусству. Лет 50 назад абстрактные экспрессионисты стали рисовать, писать картины без рам. Они в том числе хотели этим сказать, что картина не заканчивается здесь. Это не законченное что-то, а некое состояние, которое может быть.
Of course, sorry, what I should say also, of course, there's lots of music that isn't like that, and there's lots of painting that isn't like that. I'm only talking about this area now because it relates to the work I'm doing. But it doesn't mean that everything else is invalid.
Я хочу сказать, что есть много и другой музыки, и много другой живописи. Я просто этим занимаюсь, поэтому интересно, я про это рассказываю. А вообще не все там.
Спасибо.
Hello, my name is Nikolai, and my question is, don't you sometimes think that the whole idea of super genius staying outside of, minor people is kind of ahistorical? I mean, if you take Shakespeare, we know that he was a manager.
Can I just stop you for a minute? Sorry. I should have said before anyone started, don't ask questions that are too long, because they have to be translated.
Вопрос надо задавать помедленнее, потому что это надо переводить.
Please ask your question.
Пожалуйста, задайте еще раз вопрос.
Don't you sometimes think that what you say about new art is not actually new art, but sort of returning back to the roots?
Yes. Yes. Can you translate that? It's better actually, you know, if you ask questions in Russian.
Будет лучше, если вы задаете вопрос по-русски.
Мне кажется, вам нравится, что те принципы
Don't you think that the principles that
нового искусства, которые описываете,
of the art you're describing
во многом повторяют, на самом деле, принципы античного театра?
the principles of ancient theatre?
Yes, I do. I think that we went through a 300 or 400 year period, which is called the Enlightenment, where, and of course called the Romantic era as well, where suddenly the idea of the lonely individual became inflated. And I think we're past that period now. And I think we're past it for a lot of different reasons, but one of them is because we understand ecology better. So when Darwin came along, it became clear that everything was a very densely connected web, and it was very difficult to know which were the important parts and which were the trivial parts. So I think more and more we have that consciousness now that lots of things work together. It doesn't mean that, you know, everybody is equally important. What it means is that we don't know how important everybody is. We just don't know how to quantify that anymore. And I think this is very much like the pre-Enlightenment period, the pre-Renaissance period. From the Renaissance onwards, we had the idea of heroic artists. Next question.
Добрый вечер.
Good evening.
Скажите, пожалуйста, верите ли вы, что в современной музыке есть еще какое-то место для эксперимента?
Do you believe there's a place for experiments in contemporary music?
Потому что есть ощущение, что
It's
что
just a feeling that
что бы мы ни сделали, все это уже было.
whatever we do, it's already been done. We're coming back over to
I don't think anything is ever repeated.
Я не думаю, что вообще что
I think everything is new, actually, because if you do, for example, if I made an exact copy of a Little Richard record, you know, but let's say, think of a Little Richard record. Send Me Some Loving. Okay, if I made a perfect copy of Send Me Some Loving, to release that now would be completely different from releasing it in 1958. You can't repeat anything, actually, not precisely. So my feeling is that everything is new all the time. Not everything is old all the time.
Я смогу из этого получить какой-то экспириенс, который не получил.
some experience from it that I never had before.
Sorry?
So I can get some new experience with that. I find something new.
Yes, sure you can. Yeah. It seems to me there's more new music around now than ever in my life before. There's so much, I have no idea what's going on. I know like 1% of the stuff that's going on at the moment. I'm constantly hearing amazing new bands and musicians and thinking, Jesus, I've never heard of that person before. How is that possible? By the way, you have a great band playing here, Hot Chick, and I was very pleased to see them described as dance intellectuals. That's a very good combination of words. Okay. I want to be a dance intellectual. Hey, have you given up on the translation?
But I'm translating, but I've read the finished.
Okay, sorry. It's just because nobody's laughing at my jokes.
Hello, Brian, my name is Irina. And the audience, my name is Irina.
И нам по-прежнему с вами сегодня мешает оркестровая яма. Разрешите, я вам сначала вручу,
Still, there's this pit between us.
а затем
Let's
задам
let me
вопрос.
give you a flower, and then ask a question.
Oh,
Хорошо, я могу задать вопрос.
Okay, I have questions first.
yeah, and it's better that way around.
Так лучше.
Скажите, схема, которую вы описали, синяя,
Well, the scheme that you described, this senior thing,
она мне чем-то напомнила социализированное общество в лучшем его понимании.
it reminded me of a society in its best shape,
Я имею в виду социализм.
like socialism.
Yeah.
Получается, это искусство
Just mean that art
приносит нам эту новое для человечества
brings us this
кондицию,
new
новое
condition,
состояние,
new state.
которое хотели насадить когда-то нам родители.
That's our rulers wanted to plant here.
I was doing an interview this morning, and somebody...
Народный
Oh, have you not finished?
Вы еще не закончили?
Рокс, я имею в виду, да, давай.
Radio Rocks?
I'm totally confused, sorry. Are you asking me a question?
Нет, извините.
Have you finished?
Вы закончили?
Да, извините, пожалуйста.
Okay, all right. No, I was doing an interview this morning, and we were talking about communism, and I quoted something that the writer Octavio Paz said about communism. He said, just because it was the wrong answer doesn't mean it was the wrong question. So, what I think he meant by that was that in this society, at least you asked the question. We haven't even asked the question yet. So, I think Russians, despite all the tyrannies of communism, have a right to be very proud of themselves for conducting a huge experiment, which yields real information, actually. And thank you. Well, I should have told you, actually. You know, there's a tendency now, particularly in the Western world, to say, 1989, we won the Cold War. The West won. Well, I don't think the West did win, actually. I don't think anybody won. And so anyway, in answer to your question, does art lead us towards socialism necessarily? I don't know the answer. I don't think it does, actually, but I would describe myself as a socialist, I suppose, in the sense that the types of human organisation that I like and respond to are closer to socialism than they are to the kinds of things you tend to get in free market capitalist societies. So I guess I'm sort of a socialist. Or at least I'm trying to ask the right question. You know, the question is still important. Can I have the next question, please? It's a long way.
Далеко бегать.
Hello?
Да-да-да.
Thank you.
Спасибо.
Ryan, first of all, thank you very much for coming down.
Say it in Russian if you can.
По-русски можно?
It's easier for everybody.
Так легче будет всем.
Большое спасибо, что
Thanks a lot.
к нам.
For coming here.
Спасибо за эту лекцию.
Thanks for this lecture.
Потрясающе, интересно, познавательно.
It's amazingly interesting and very educating.
Thank you.
Я сам музыкант.
I'm a musician myself, composer.
Мне, когда вы назвали композицию, которая, кажется, называлась 50 Bars in C.
What was this composition being named 50 bars?
It's called In C.
Называется «Вдох».
Yeah.
Хорошо. Я тут же вспомнил композицию, которую написала Фрэнк Заппа, которая называется «Proxy».
It reminded me of Frank Zappa's Proxy, traditional music, the way we traditionally understand it.
И то, что уже трудно назвать музыкой.
And what is hard to describe as
Больше
music
похоже на искусство.
was more art.
Как вы думаете, нам, со стороны создателей,
Do you think that we creators, artists, should
вешать впервые на то, что мы создаем, и в какой момент произведение заканчивает музыкой,
when does the music,
другим?
when does it start with the
It's a
music?
very long question.
Очень длинный вопрос.
I don't quite understand the question, so
Следующий понял вопрос.
Sergey, could you, wherever you are,
Here, stage left to the roof.
can you very quickly condense that question for me?
Should we label a work of art that's on the border between music and art? And when is it over? When does it stop being music and become something else?
Well, I don't really mind about the name that it's called. In fact, it doesn't really have a name in this area. Just like the music we're listening to now doesn't have a proper name. We're losing half our audience. There we go. So, I like thinking of names for things. You know, ambient was a great name for a form of music that a lot of people were already doing. And because I invented the name, people think I invented the form of music, but I didn't really. I thought of a way of describing it. So maybe in the end I'll think of a nice description of this new form, but I haven't done yet. I think we're going to take two more questions.
One more question.
One more question.
Последний вопрос.
Здравствуйте, очень рада, что уже второй раз вижу вас живьем в Санкт-Петербурге. И вот хотела спросить у вас, в прошлый раз мне посчастливилось видеть вас в 2005 году на сцене. Собираетесь ли вы выступать как музыкант в Санкт-Петербурге?
Sorry?
Are you going to perform as a musician in St-Petersburg?
How much is it worth? No, I don't know actually. I don't perform much as a musician because I can't really play any instruments, you know. So it's a bit difficult getting a recording studio onto a stage. But maybe I just don't know the answer. I haven't got any plans to perform here. I like being in this city, so maybe I will one day. This is a great city. You should all be very happy to live here. And with that, I'm going to bid you all good night.
Находишь